recording? Okay, thank you. Now, welcome to another book talk organized by the International Society for the Critical Study of Divination. My name is Michael Lackner, and I have the honor to work as the president of that society. You'll find our website under criticaldivination.org. The society was established in 2016 in the framework of the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities with the title Fate, Freedom and Prognostication, Strategies of Coping with the Future in East Asia and Europe. And since 2023, the society acts as a successor to the consortium, whose funding by the German Ministry of Education and Research lasted 14 years from 2009 to 2023. Well, during this period, we edited a book series with Brill with 11 volumes by now, and more volumes are in preparation. In addition, we also edited a journal entitled International Journal of Divination and Prognostication, also with Brill. So together with the book series, Prognostication in History, the consortium and now the Society for the Critical Study of Divination have established or have contributed to establishing the research of pre-modern forms of prediction, forecasting, prognosis, briefly strategies of coping with the future as a solid, consolidated field within the humanities. Following an idea of our colleague Dr. Li Gang, we started to stage a series of talks on the books that we have been publishing so far. It's my pleasure to host these talks, which we began with the most recent book in Prognostication and History, and now continue with other publications that are relevant to our topics. Our talks can also be found on YouTube. And the next talk is scheduled for February 6th with Stephanie Omola. Now, let me briefly introduce today's speakers. First, the author of the book, Laws of the Land, Fengshui and the State in Qing China. Tristan Brown is SC Fang, Chinese Language and Culture Career Development Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He holds a PhD from Columbia University. His research focuses on the ways in which, I quote, law, science, environment, and religion interacted in China from the 16th to the 19th centuries. From his numerous other publications, I take the liberty to cite only one, which is called A Mountain of Saints and Sages, Muslims in the Landscape of Popular Religion in Late Imperial China, which appeared in number 105 in Tungbao, because this already points to the publication he is preparing, a study which examines the history of Islam in the Qing Dynasty, when many Muslims communities integrated into Chinese societies. And among his many international fellowships, I just want to mention the one at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, because this institution brings us to the discussant in today's book talk, Professor Dagmar Schäfer. Since 2013, she is one of the directors of the MPI and currently its executive director. Her monograph, The Crafting of the 10,000 Things, Knowledge and Technology in 17th Century China, University of Chicago Press, 2011, received the Pfizer Award and Joseph Levinson Book Prize. And recent publications include the working group volumes, Ownership of Knowledge Beyond Intellectual Property, MIT Press, 2023, which is co-edited with Annapurna Madipudi and Marius Booning, and another one, Plurilingualism in Traditional Eurasian Scholarship, Thinking in Many Tongues, co-edited with Glenn Moss and Morten Söderblom Sarila. In 2020, Dagmar Schäfer was awarded the Leibniz Prize by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the German Research Foundation, for development of new approaches to cultural studies and the resulting comparative perspective on a comprehensive global history. Thanks for joining this talk, and let me humbly begin with a question for Professor Brown. In my view, your book has shown the intrinsic rationality of Feng Shui practices in terms of their impact on the environment, their evaluation by the literati, the officials, and the common people. It was thus an integral part of what Mark Kalinowski called the sciences of traditional China, les sciences de la Chine traditionnelle, which also included horoscopy and numerous other arts that were later labeled superstitious. Now, if we grant these arts a sort of scientific character, we must first establish their systematic nature. They were systematic, no doubt about that. And a second criterion would be the existence of a debate, a discussion about different approaches and methods. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the question of the discourse, general discourse on Feng Shui, the debates around it, perhaps debates between different schools, different interpretations, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, I'll get started. Thank you so much, Professor Lochner. Thank you so much, very much for the kind introduction. As I was saying, as people were coming in, I've been wanting to meet Professor Lochner for such a long time. It's so wonderful to finally do it over Zoom. I also want to thank Professor Schäfer, of course, who I worked with at the Max Planck Institute. Thank Li Gong for organizing all this. It's really wonderful. So Professor Lochner just posed a wonderful question, which I will try to address in my talk today. I think I have 25 minutes. Li Gong, is that right?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll try to get through 25 minutes. And so basically, let me just play from the current slide. Okay, so I think you all know, well, let me just introduce the book, right? So here's what I'm going to do today. This is my recent book, Laws of the Land, Feng Shui in the State in Qing Dynasty China. And so what I will do today in terms of the talk outline, I've broken it down. I'll briefly define Feng Shui. Probably nobody in the audience needs a definition of Feng Shui, but I'll give you one anyway. I'll introduce the book's argument. I'll give you some example cases from that showcase, I think, uses of divination in Chinese law. We'll look maybe briefly at Feng Shui in the civil examination system, just a very brief overview. And then finally, I'll conclude with future avenues for research and discussion. Now, and hopefully over the course of the next 25 minutes, I'll touch on maybe Professor Lochner's question. If we don't, we'll get to it certainly in the discussion. Okay, so really briefly, what is Feng Shui? In the book, I define Feng Shui in 3 registers. First as a knowledge, second as a practice, and then finally as a discourse. So as a knowledge, I define it as a divinatory knowledge of orienting structures such as graves and houses in accordance with cosmological principles in the flow of qi. Now, you know, nobody, I'm sure, here needs a definition of qi. There's one if you need one: vital essence, an unseeable atomic life force that runs through all matter. Now, one way in which this knowledge sort of operated in Chinese society, I like to give the metaphor with medicine, right? So you have human veins, right? Jing Mai or Luo Mai, that transmitted qi in the body, concentrated in certain nodes along the body. And likewise with Feng Shui, which I believe intellectually, you know, Feng Shui in medicine in China evolved very much in relation with one another over the centuries. You have these veins, you know, Di Mai, Long Mai, various different veins that run through the land, channeling such qi. Now, when that knowledge is put into practice, Feng Shui served as a kind of medicine of the land. And so I find that heuristic a sort of useful way of thinking and sort of envisioning about what Feng Shui was in Chinese society over across the centuries. Now, final point before moving on here is this one word I've highlighted and read at the top: discourse. You know, how people in China talked. In many ways, medicine today is a discourse in our society, right? I'm not a doctor, but I can talk to, tell my mother to do this. My mother can tell me to do this, how we express care for one another. And Feng Shui was very much like that in Chinese society of the pre-20th century period, right? It's everybody, whether they were experts in it, specialists in it, or lay people who knew a little bit about it, they could mobilize it in the kind of discourse. And this is kind of what this slide right here kind of brings us through. I won't dwell on it. I'll just say that as a discourse, Feng Shui really tied every level of Chinese society together. From emperors, who, of course, we could talk about imperial Feng Shui, to scholars, which I'll talk about the examinations in a little while. Scholars very much cared about the feng shui of the towns, city walls, physical structures around the towns, pagodas, academies, etc., and saw it as related to their examination success. And then finally, of course, commoners who cared about their houses and graves of their parents and their families for their health and financial well-being. Okay, so with that in that definition put on front, let me just briefly break down my historiography. And I'm very happy to say in my historiography of Feng Shui, I have a few Germans to mention, actually. First, Ernest Johann Edel in 1873. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this work, Feng Shui, the Rudiments of Natural Science in China. He noticed something in this work that, he quotes, Feng Shui has a legal status in China. Law courts adjudicate cases on the presumption that Feng Shui is a reality and a truth, not a fiction. And then Max Weber, a few decades later, of course, talked about Feng Shui in his, what is translated into English as the religions of China, right? Magic involves the stereotyping of technology and economic relations. When attempts were made in China to inaugurate the building of railways and factories, conflict with geomancy ensued. What I simply want to say here in terms of this historiography is that Feng Shui becomes a word in Western languages by the 19th century. I've traced it at least to the third edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in the 1790s, and it proliferated thereafter. And so foreigners writing about Feng Shui in the 19th century perceived it as irrational, but important in China. They actually took time to write about it, talk about it, say why it was important, even if they thought it was irrational. So then where my book comes in is my book is not just in conversation with this 19th century moment, it's very much in conversation with this 20th century moment. So what I see happening in the 20th century in terms of the historiography is a kind of academic divergence between the legal scholars and scholars of cosmology, religion, divination in China. So you have this revision in the 20th century of, revising understanding of Chinese law, like Philip Huang, for instance. But in general, these legal historians emphasize the secular nature of Chinese law. So they focus on the Great Qing Code or the Great Ming Code. They emphasize, they kind of work around what those 19th century observers were discussing, right? Now, there was a group of people who did talk about Feng Shui in quite detail in the 20th century, which was, of course, the anthropologists. And they revised our understandings of Feng Shui, right? People like Ole Brun, and of course, many others. But the thing about the anthropologists and their ethnographic fieldwork in the Hong Kong New Territories or Taiwan, Singapore, etc., is that the context was the 20th century. It was not the context of imperial China. And we have to realize, like, both in terms of urbanization, this, legal statute, legal standards, everything had changed by that time. So this is this kind of divergence. We have sort of historians revising Chinese law, anthropologists revising Chinese feng shui, but they're not really in conversation with each other. And so this is what my book really tried to do, right? So you have a growing body of work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Paul Katz's Divine Justice, Religion and the Development of Chinese Legal Culture. Zhang Yonglin, who sees religion in Chinese law. Katz sees law in Chinese religion. And then Laws of the Land, Feng Shui in the State and Qing Dynasty China, which tries to reunite these kind of previously divergent fields. So just to briefly give you the argument, the first part of my argument is that the Qing state consciously accorded a space in legal practice for the consideration of feng shui claims, and I claim that that space needed to be there. In other words, divination's use in law isn't inherently irrational, and that's something I think Professor Lackner already got to in his question. And then I basically point out during the 19th century, demographic, environmental, and political stresses elevated the salience of feng shui in Qing law. In the interest of time today, I won't be focusing on the second part of this argument, but it's there in the book if you're interested. Okay, so let's start off with this question of divination's uses and invocations in law. If we put on the table for a second and say Qing courts recognize damaging feng shui as a potential criminal offense, but the question then becomes, how can feng shui be damaged? And through looking at these cases in the Qing legal archive, I basically found 4 scenarios in which people identified feng shui being damaged and courts potentially recognizing that. One, cutting down a tree deemed to be connected to feng shui. Trees, of course, surrounded cemeteries and grave sites were very important for a variety of religious reasons, also geomantic ones. Mining a mountain deemed to be connected to feng shui. There's a lot of feng shui litigation about mining, changing the direction of important water flows, and then finally building something that local residents don't like, right? And that's something that continues with new age applications of feng shui today, we could say. Okay. Now, there's this question that I had when I was researching this book, which is how common was this phenomenon, right? We say, okay, people brought lawsuits about feng shui in the Qing Dynasty, but how many lawsuits, right? Do we have any data about it? Now, of course, the legal archive is, let's say, unevenly preserved, but we have some fascinating observations from Qing officials, especially those posted in South China, who tell us that there was quite a lot. Here's, for instance, Zhou Renji, the judicial administrator of Hunan province, who says every season that this office opens for lawsuit submissions, people contesting feng shui present around half the plaints. Now, in my own work in Sichuan province's legal archives, I didn't find half of all lawsuits about feng shui, but I found a good amount of them, right? I speculate in the introduction to the book about what percentage, but I use in the study 500 legal cases from Sichuan, Beijing, and Taiwan. I also use maps drawn to record or investigate feng shui. And then finally, I look, and then this is the source I'm actually kind of, in retrospect, the most proud about in the book is these feng shui manuals. These are guides for how to do feng shui. And what my sort of methodology was reading the legal cases and reading the manuals and trying to match principles found in the manuals with those invoked in the legal cases. And what you'll see is that these manuals are not from Sichuan province. They're actually from other provinces, from Jiangnan area, for instance. And yet the principles can still be recognized and invoked, some 2,000 kilometers away. So just really briefly, let me give you an example of houses, right? Everybody loves houses. I like houses too, right? So let's look at a case about houses. I really enjoy this case. What you have here is the Wang family. This is in Nambu County, and there's been a relative of the Wang lineage that is added. You can see in this map at the bottom right here, they've added a sort of structure in front of the courtyard home of the Wangs. This goes to courts. Members of the Wang lineage aren't happy about it. And the official adjudicates the case, and he says, by looking at elevation, that in fact feng shui was not disturbed in this case. But still, the new addition that you see there in the front should still be moved. Now, when I read this verdict for the first time, I said, what is he talking about? Why is this official talking about this principle that wasn't previously mentioned anywhere in the case file? And then what you can see here, this image from this text, that says Chenggao, right? This figure 2.5, a high front house. The Qing official was in fact invoking a feng shui principle found in feng shui manuals that say you should not. Do I have it here? I don't have it here, but it's okay. Basically, the front of the house must be lower than the rear of the house, otherwise it's inauspicious. And if you will, if you look at, for instance, Chinese architecture, this is something I rarely see pointed out. This is a Lugong Temple in Taiwan. You can see the rear of the temple will be the highest elevation of the structure. You can also see this in the Forbidden City, Jingshan Park, at the northern part of the palace, the highest point. So this is something that was recognized in legal practice. It was recognized across a very large cultural area of China, and you can see it in this one local county case invoked here. Another case, going back to the question of trees, is the ways in which trees gave information to courts about the dead, about where the dead were really buried. We have to remember that in Qing society, actually, most people were not buried with tombstones or headstones. Those were expensive. They needed to be chiseled, everything like that. This is a graveyard you could see here of a fairly wealthy family, a wealthy lineage in North China. We do have the phenomenon of fake graves, people burying animal bones in the ground, claiming it's their ancestor, all of that. And you can see here in this case, the court was able to adjudicate and resolve it by noticing the lack of tree cover around those five, you could say, darkly colored triangles to the south, thereby being able to therefore conclude these five are fake graves. You can see there the reliance on the divinatory knowledge to come to a satisfactory legal conclusion, otherwise unknowable to the state. Final example, this one I really enjoy, the example of oil presses and the examinations. I'll just say very briefly, oil presses are a big deal, right? People need oil to cook. Oil is a very cooking oils is a very laborious process. And you can see the feng shui manuals from the Qing Dynasty emphasize that you shouldn't have a house next to an oil press shop. The reasons for this are obvious. It's very loud to produce. You have to have a big fire. You have to have a big log. You pound the oil out. You can see here there's a list of things that you shouldn't build your house next to. And you can see that scholars who were preparing for the examinations, they would invoke the principle to shut down certain oil presses that had opened up that they weren't particularly happy about. So you can see here an example, this illegal comment trying to resolve a conflict in Ba County, basically with the local officials saying, move your oil press to another part of the town. And you can see here, for instance, if you look closely at gazetteer maps, oil press streets or oil press shops will be typically located outside of walled towns, away from the important yamens, schools, academies, etc. The reason for that, one can speculate, not only the loudness of making oil, but also the fact that oil is flammable. So people paid a lot of attention to this. All right, really, really briefly, I just have a few moments left here, so I don't want to take too much time, and I want to leave time for the conversation. But I'll just say about the civil service exam. I have a whole chapter on this in the book. I believe feng shui was very, very important for not just scholars who were taking the exams, but also for the working of the broader examination system. Let me explain why I feel that, why I observe that. You know that most people took these exams, never passed to the point of becoming an official. The passing rate by 1800 was far less than 1%. So what's the deal? Well, we have to think of it like this. There's a sort of landscape across the Qing Empire, all the places that are taking and participating in the exam. Some parts of the empire have fabulous results, relatively speaking, like Jiangnan, for instance. That's even reflected in provincial juren quotas, for instance. Every time the exams are offered, they have good quotas. And then you have parts of the empire that they don't perform as well. They don't have that many scholars. They don't produce that many officials. And so then I realized when I was looking at these parts of Sichuan, which performed actually quite poorly during the Qing Dynasty. You can see even in the provincial degrees, they had quite a low quota. Officials coming to Nambu County could not tell the people of Nambu County that they were all untalented. They needed to say something different. So of course they said something completely believable. They said, you're just unlucky. And so this is the key point, that success is a product of talent and fortune. And you can't run a civil services system where you only pretend like talent matters, right? You have to give a space that fortune might also matter. And I very much think the Qing state gave that space. That's how the system worked. Now, there's a flip side to this observation, which is to say, okay, if good examination results are the products of talent and fortune, who is the best at feng shui? It means the government officials, because the government officials were both wealthy and they had, by definition, passed the exams. That's the major reason. That's a major reason people sought out their opinions in court about feng shui, and a reason the government could adjudicate these cases with confidence. So that's my biggest sort of, I think, insight from the book. Feng shui enabled people at the bottom of the power structure to protest to their superiors, while their superiors always retained the power to make the final decision. That's why feng shui could work in the law as the law. Okay, and so that's I think the big, aha moment. And now I'll just say, and this gets to addressing a little bit of Professor Lochner's question at the beginning of this talk, which is, I don't discuss this in great detail in the book, but I think it's well worth paying attention to, which is, how did the Qing government know which theories of feng shui were true from the many feng shui texts that were in circulation? And this is one thing that I noticed when I looked at official feng shui manuals from the Qing Dynasty, which is the government also looked to the examination system. That is, famous families, especially in South China, that had produced very high-ranking officials. The government was actually interested in what their graves looked like. So this is not simply a story of knowledge from the top trickling down to the bottom. It's also knowledge from the bottom trickling up to the top. That conversation is exactly where this feng shui knowledge is being produced. All right, now in my final just 3 minutes, 2 minutes even, I'll now turn to avenues for future research. This is something that came out of the book that I think is really, really worth looking at. And I know there have been some great scholars working with Professor Schäfer at the Max Planck who have looked a little bit at this or who are now working on this, in fact. And so I'm excited to see more research come out, which is these yin-yang officers, what I translate yin-yang officers, yin-yang xueguan. And something that before I started researching this book, I didn't even realize that every county across the empire, every prefecture across the empire had an official whose job was to be good at this kind of divination. You can see this is from the Da Qing Huidian, right? The rules laying out, about, how, every county has to have one, every prefecture has to have one, how they're selected and so on. Just to illustrate, so first of all, what did they do? Well, they do meteorological stuff. They do astronomical stuff. They participate in eclipse rituals. They also do feng shui for the government. But this slide, I want to raise to your attention because I think it illustrates something that's well worth thinking about, which is, remember, there weren't that many officials to begin with. This is a relatively thin bureaucracy on paper. So, for instance, at the Kaifeng in Henan province, prefectural yamen in the early Qing dynasty, or relatively early 18th century, there's only 16 officials. And one of them is the head of the yin-yang school, right? So 1 out of 16 for the officials on staff at the yamen. There's one in the prefecture. There's also one at the county level. Add it up, and you end up with thousands of officials, even though they're, low ranked 9B or unranked in the 9 scale system. across the empire. It's a good amount. This definitely deserves further study. And this, by the way, for those of I realize there's some I saw Volker Oles in the audience, fantastic. The Taoist officials, the Buddhist officials. I mean, this is a whole world that I think we could really talk about. Another avenue for future research, I'll just really say quickly here, is calendrical data. This is something that I came across very, very often in legal cases. I think the Chinese calendar deserves far greater attention and study in the Western Academy. And I'll just say there one obvious example right under our noses is the marriage cases that involve horoscopes, right? The Gengtie, those are critical pieces of evidence for showing that somebody's been married, somebody's been married or a proposal's been given, and that's all divinatory knowledge. So this is another example where you see it in the legal system. And then finally, I'd say another avenue for future research, the history of the compass. This is something that came out during the research of my book. I realized how important compasses were as technical instruments for cartography. And in a sense, this may be one of the reasons that Feng Shui and Feng Shui diviners exerted such an influence over Chinese cartography for so long. Because they were the ones who had these compasses, right? They knew how to map things. So this is something that I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. I don't want to talk anymore because I want to give it over to Professor Schäfer. Thank you all very much for coming to the talk. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I mean, this was very instructive and really shed light on your book, but also on future avenues of research. And it made me think, I mean, especially the calendrical science, Feng Shui is not only about place, it's also about time, right? But now I want to hand over to Professor Schäfer. Please, Dagmar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for welcoming this round and for inviting me for such an onerous task, Tristan. Michael, it's really great to see you and all the people in the audience. I hope you can actually hear me well because I had some instabilities in my internet, so please wave if it doesn't work. So Tristan, first, congratulations to this fantastic book, which I think I read a kind of like some pre-versions of it. I could enjoy that. And then reading through the book entirely once again for this exercise was such a great joy. Your writing style and the level of detail that you are bringing is so wonderful. And it's also, I think, something that will bring you into a lot of trouble, because I guess that a lot of historians, whether they do law, science, religion, Qing studies, will now claim that you're in their field. However, certainly, I think you're a historian of science and technology. And of course, your future directions already indicated to that very fact that I hope that we a little bit convinced you that this is where you actually belong, because that allows you to draw attention to all the other things. So because I know the audience will probably also want to ask questions, I will restrict myself to 3 points. And the first of it has a little bit to do, I think, with the question, with a history of science angle. Then I want to talk, want to ask you a second question about the role of archives and regional focus of your study. And in the third, I will ask you to us a little bit of where you situate yourself in the lay of the land of like the current research going on in adjacent fields. So let me begin with the first question. For those of you, you have the book on your hands, you can see that the book begins with a quotation. And in this quotation of the Qing Astronomical Bureau, you actually translate Feng Shui, which a lot of people would translate literally into wind and water, as earthly principles. And this is certainly one thing I would like to connect to a question about what Feng Shui actually is, what the generic definition of it is, and how you dealt with that in your book and how it changes over time. One of the enormous questions that the field of East Asian studies had to deal with is this juxtaposition that modern research does between religion and science, between laws and customs, between what is rational, irrational, and belief, or even something that Michael Lackner has studied a lot about, Mixin, right? Superstition, stuff like that. So how does one deal with something that really gives you like an indication of what you should do in the present or in the future that is somewhat geographically related, a wind and water practice, but then has to say something like basically deferring from the present into something you should actually do. What actually is feng shui? Is it basically geographical? My second question relates to the role of archives, and I would also say to the regional focus, which I realized you pointed to in a couple of times in your lectures, but I think it is such an important issue also for the way in which the discipline actually works. And I want to connect it a little bit with one slide reference to the graves that you were actually pointing at, which certainly reminded me of Tom Mulaney's project and the Chinese death games. And like there is an implicit question here about like how there is a whole trajectory of using the death to think about land in a different way. But what really, really excited me, I think, is certainly that you excavated all this information from an archive that is not in Jiangnan, one of the major focus of Chinese studies, especially of discussions on religion and science, divination, and all these kind of issues. So I wonder if you could say something about your experiences with that archive and the regional focus in relation also to the first question of what feng shui actually means and how probably representative this case actually is and how the discipline should probably deal with such archival particularities, right? Or very, very important sources. So how do they change our picture about China, the Qing dynasty, and its changes? The third question has a little bit to do with I think, really some really interesting books that came out, maybe even in the last 3 to 4 years. And I want to mention 4 of them just as a pointer. I know I could mention many more, but I think they are somewhat related to what you're doing. So you have a book by Chen Ke-jin on porcelain for the emperor, who basically makes a major claim about how you should actually read these archives, right? How you should think about bureaucracies, how you should actually think about how officials use these archives, among them, not necessarily only the legal cases. So I want to know how you place yourself in relation to these more practice-oriented archives. Should we think of the law cases in a similar way or differently? Then the second book is about rainmaking. So rainmakers for the cosmopolitan empire. I'm pretty sure you know this very important book as well, who highlights also the intersection of religion and statecraft and looks at textual manuals on Tibetan rainmaking. So this question of how you situate a region within a general policy is very much discussed in this work as well. The third book I would like to mention is by Christina Kleutgen on the mathematics of art, so the polyhedrons in late imperial China, that explores the intersection of mathematics and art. And that certainly also asks about like, how do you actually decipher from what you have, what you want to have in the future, and how do you use bureaucracy as a way to understand the Qing era knowledge cultures. And the final one, I think, is one by Maura Dijkstra that has received very critical reviews, amongst others, but that certainly makes important arguments about commercial practices in the Qing era, the way in which this offers insight into the economic and social dynamics of the period. And it's also an invitation, this last pointer, to say something about how you see a larger literati culture sitting in the generic everyday. I stop it here because I know this was already quite a lot, but I hope you don't need to answer to all of them, but congratulations again. This is an amazing book. And if you have not really read through it, you should really start now.
Thank you so much, Professor Schäfer. It's so wonderful to see you again. I miss our conversations in Berlin, and so it's just great. It's great to hear you. Let me sort of address your first question, and I think tie it into Professor Lochner's question at the beginning as well, which is this question of, well, what is feng shui, right? What is it? What do we call it? let me say this, right? When I looked at the existing literature on this topic, people would always talk about schools of feng shui, compass school, form school, all of that. And I fully believe that there are contexts in which those fine details, those particularities really mattered. But what was interesting about the legal materials that I was looking at, whether they were from Sichuan or Taiwan, for instance, is some supplementary material, it never came up, right? In other words, nobody ever presented a lawsuit and said, I'm talking about form school feng shui right now, or I'm talking about compass school feng shui right now. People invoked compass directions, people invoked landforms, and it was one sort of spectrum of knowledge. Now, it is true that the Qing state tried to, I don't want to say structure feng shui, but they wrote books about it. So therefore, they did, by definition, try to structure it. And I think the official line was something like, the form school is superior to the compass school, but it encompasses the compass school too, right? Something like that. Now, on your question as to earthly principle, feng shui, wind and water, all of this, this is a very important point because in the book, for the sake of readability, I take many, many different terms that are related to divination in the land, and I call them feng shui in English. Sometimes that is the word they're actually using. Sometimes they're using something, a kanyu, dili. There's all spectrum of terms that come up. It just got very unwieldy for readers, right? If I'm using all of those different terms, right? So I admittedly simplified that landscape, but I do think I'll just say on this point, there was a recognized body of knowledge under the label of Kanyu, Dili, Feng Shui, something like this. At times, these terms were interchangeable. At times, they were used discreetly. One thing that I've noticed, and I'd be curious about other people in the audience if you notice this as well, is that Feng Shui typically refers to either the the practice of sort of analyzing the land to explain something that happened in the past or for the future in a neutral way or in a kind of slightly dismissive way. In other words, it's kind of the popular term. Dili, earthly principle, or Kanyu are like terms that literati people in Jiangnan like to use, right? So, you have a lot of books, Dili Xinshu, the new book on geomancy, essentially, right? Formal ways of saying the earthly principles. This gets us into a whole question of Chinese geographical thought, the intellectual history of Chinese geographical thought, and what role feng shui played in it. Of course, it's not exclusively about feng shui, the history of Dili in China, but feng shui is a big part of it, right? So that's a kind of long-winded way of thinking about what some of the terms mean and the categories and all of that. Regarding some of the works that you mentioned, very interesting. I try to be in conversation with a whole number of fields as you bring out. I think that one thing regarding rainmaking that's quite relevant here is the performance of feng shui. In particular, something that I notice is that, officials cannot stand in front of the crowd and say, sorry, I don't know anything, right? They're never going to say that, right? These are super confident, if arrogant, oftentimes from Jiangnan literati who have passed the exams and have been sent out to the West. And they're going to basically say 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, no, I know the answer, right? And of course, in that courtroom, they probably do know right. They do know more about this in some ways. Now I want to make it clear because I don't want to sound classist here in any way. There's plenty of local knowledge, right, that is so interwoven in these texts that they have no idea about, right? Or that they simply are totally ignorant of. When I mean the officials, the literati. But they need to say something, right? And in part, something that I realized in these land tenure cases even though China had all these contracts and even though there were genealogies and stuff, the record is so, spotty, right? There's just a lot that the government doesn't know. And so feng shui in this divinatory knowledge is a way of the government saying, no, we know the answer. Don't worry, we have it. We're under control, right? We know what the right answer is. So I think that's why this was so important, right? And that's why literati, not only when they would study the I Ching, take a look at the calendar and things like that, they would pay attention to stuff like this. So I think that, and then let me think of regarding, oh, well, other kinds of archives, right? That's an excellent point. One thing I'll just say here is, of course, it goes without saying that, we find information and knowledge of feng shui not just in the legal archive, right? We also, I mean, it's so ubiquitous throughout gazetteers, and I should give a call out to Chen Shipei, who I know is here, and I had a wonderful, the Logart database, I'll give a call out to that, made a huge difference when I was researching this book during my time in Berlin. There's so much feng shui knowledge that's written into those kinds of materials. And I'll give you an example here, even that, for instance, an elite family who's contributing to a gazetteer might incorporate references to their own feng shui, their own family's feng shui, or a lawsuit that they've won, presumably to get it into the public record so that everybody knows they control that river, right? Or something like that. So this knowledge percolates far beyond, right, just the legal archive, let's say. It goes into other kinds of sources. I think I covered some of your questions there. So and I'll keep thinking about your other wonderful comments. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your answer, which is again highly instructive. I have done some research on Ji Yun, Ji Xiaolan, the compiler, or one of the main compiler of the Siku Quanshu, and his brush notes, in fact. Not only the introduction to the Shu section, but also his brush notes. And there is a certain difference, he is a stern official, in the Siku Quanshu section, which these arts cannot entirely be dismissed, but but his brush notes are full of anecdotes and anecdotes on feng shui, but also on horoscopy. And at a certain moment, he says, yes, feng shui specialists, I mean, the Kanyu specialists their knowledge cannot be entirely dismissed. But I personally, he was very interested in Fulan, spirit writing. As a homme de lettres, of course, I mean, writing was the thing that attracted him. But at a certain moment, he says, no, I prefer horoscopy over a feng shui. Why? Because horoscopy determines even the place where you're going to be buried. And so of course that's an interesting anecdote. But that was a stand. I mean, he had a take of a relatively high official and literatus, right? Yeah, but that would also be worthwhile to look more into, brush notes, of course, as you mentioned, not only the legal records, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much for this point, Professor Lochner. And one of the things that I think is really important that I encountered again and again in legal archives is that you'll have one official who will say, I don't believe in feng shui, and then he'll do feng shui. You know what I mean? So this is something that what people say, this gets into this question of how we translate, when do they invoke? Anytime I find the Chinese verb xin, to believe, is invoked, it means they don't believe it. When they say something like, well, the vein has been severed, they're making an empirical observation, right? And hence the belief is not invoked, right? It is not needed or something like that. Professor Schäfer, please.
Yes, please, Dagmar.
I want to pose a question that was asked by Jeffrey Kotick in the chat. Jeffrey Kotick is a historian of who's very knowledgeable about the early astronomy, and I think he's also worked with Michael. And he asked how representative the Feng Shui texts in the Siku Chunshu or other canons are of how it was practiced in real life. So do the canonical texts describe or indicate what people actually did? Or I think you could ask the same question for the legal issues as well, and how you can you actually differentiate between common and elite levels?
Yeah, this is a great question. I have found for instance, the Book of Burial, Zhangjing's, the Classic of Burial, those types of, and its commentaries, those works that get invoked in the Siku Shu to be quite abstract, and I have not seen them invoked in the legal setting. So therefore, I think that there were texts that give you practical guides, for instance, of how to build houses, which incorporate feng shui knowledge, and things like that. So I'll say that I think that the canonical texts are quite abstract. However, there is a spectrum of feng shui text, and right now I'm working with actually. I'm doing a translation of a late Ming feng shui text that it was a commentary on the Snowheart Rhapsody that's very practical. And what I mean by that is, for instance, it identifies objects or places that make noise pollution harm feng shui. There's a lot of noise discussion regarding, good feng shui and how noises, like polluting noises, can disturb an area's feng shui. And that's a wonderful text that gives you plenty of examples of objects that are seen, certain types of mills people thought is loud, right? I give an example in the book actually also of the flour sieving machine that is seen as loud and hence harming of feng shui. That's something that was identified in feng shui manuals and then invoked in legal settings. So the thing is, Jeffrey, wonderful question. You're absolutely right. There's a big spectrum of feng shui text. Some more abstract, canonical tends to be very, yin yang and, water method and things like that. Two things that you can clearly tell are very practical. One way that I think you can think of this is commentaries on the classical text tend to be more practical than the texts themselves, if that makes sense, because the commentary tells you actually how it's employed or how it's deployed. And then finally, on the question of the elite versus popular divergence. Well, this is always a great question for all scholars of Chinese religion, right? What's elite religion? What's popular religion? What I can say is that clearly feng shui had a remarkable pull over a wide socioeconomic spectrum in the Qing. Obviously, the people who were big property owners or who had passed the exams were taken particularly seriously about it, were taken seriously for their feng shui knowledge. But I'll give you one example of a localization of Sichuan in the Sichuan case. So in many places, let's say Jiangnan, you pass the exams, okay, you must have good feng shui. You're talented, but you also have the fortune. In Sichuan, we don't have many degree holders, not many Juren provincial degree holders around. So what do we have a lot of? We have salt merchants. And these salt merchants, I have a discussion in the book of how the salt merchants in Sichuan have to know where to drill for the salt. And there's a huge amount of upfront capital you need, and it's very risky, and it can be a huge reward or a huge loss. So in Sichuan, successful salt merchants were thought to be extremely good at feng shui, and people would ask salt merchants in Zhejiang and other parts of Sichuan to bury their grandparents because you have to because they've gotten wealthy off drilling for salt and identifying where the good fortune is deep beneath the ground. There also must be good at burial. So that's a kind of like Sichuan localization, but it gives us an example of kind of in the absence of the elite degree holder, who is the expert on this knowledge, if that makes sense. So it's a great question. I'm happy to talk to you more about it.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes left, so if you have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. I want to ask one question that really kind of like is a little bit related to the regional focus and to Jeffrey's question, and this is the question of like how Chinese are the Chinese people actually are in Sichuan, right? So how is this relation between Qing, yeah, so Manchu and Fengshui? So you're really dealing with a period when the great Qing emperors basically have done their deed, yeah. So you start like somehow around 1800, and then you end basically on the demise of the Qing dynasty. So can you say something about what people are we actually really, and why then Feng Shui, which seems to be so Chinese, right, with such a long
Yes.
tradition?
Well, let me just say, thank you so much for this question, Professor Schäfer. I think, at least in the Qing period, I cannot say for all parts of the Qing Empire, but I tend to think that feng shui is more than a Chinese practice. It's Sinophone, or you know, the Koreans did feng shui in big numbers, Vietnamese. So it went with the Chinese writing system, also with the examination system. The other thing is, Qing officials, the Manchus get very interested in feng shui pretty early, as soon as they want to conquer China, right? It's like, take a look at the Dragon Vein. That's very clear. And then Manchu officials who are posted to Tibet, they seemingly think that the Tibetans are very interested in feng shui. Now, the thing is that, of course, I think this is a question of language. I'm sure the Tibetans cared about, where people mined, and I'm sure that there was lots of beliefs about the land, and the Qing officials were like, "What is that? How do we talk about that?" Right back to the palace. Okay, they did feng shui. Um, but what I mean to say is, I tend to think that for people like Qianlong or otherwise, they thought that places that had knowledge and learning and power, of course they would do feng shui, right? You know what I'm saying? They didn't see it as a Chinese thing. And that's what's so fascinating. In treaty port newspapers like Shunbao in the 1860s, you have articles where it's like telling people that actually Germans and Americans and British don't do feng shui. Right. Like that was news to people, like, they don't have this one. Right. So I think that this is kind of, it's a wonderful question. And it is interesting. We do today, of course, completely understandably have that association. But I think it's interesting to think about it from the kind of, maybe we see it as a transnational practice in Asia. But yeah, Professor Lochner, please.
Thank you. I mean, this is what the Chinese call the Westerners know Buran, divine about people, but they
Mhm.
don't know Budi.
Right, 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 right.
It's not. But I have a last question, perhaps, if you allow. When preparing the exhibit I co-organized in 2021 at the National Museum in Nuremberg about the material culture of divination, and of course of magic, because magic and divination go hand in hand sometimes. I came across a table or a chart, a collection of charts that was organized in a genealogical way. That is to say, we saw, or you could see, the places of burial according to the generations and the development, of course, with very few commentaries, but there were comments. This guy and so on has made a fortune or became Tinsche in something, et cetera, et cetera. Was that common? I mean, this kind of genealogical feng shui or feng
Yes.
shui genealogy, if you want.
Yeah, so absolutely. This is a wonderful point. I'm glad you raised it. Feng Shui is pervasive throughout Chinese genealogies. And in fact, Chinese genealogies contain some of the best Feng Shui maps. We have, lineages, especially in Huizhou, Anhui, southern Anhui area, map entire villages for the benefit of their lineage in Feng Shui terms. You also see that in Fujian and in other places. So for sure, this is something that we definitely see. What I will say about Sichuan is Sichuan didn't have particularly strong genealogies. And the reason is because it was an immigrant society during the Qing, relatively recent, not particularly large lineages. But people still cared about feng shui. You know, it's just, this is an example, for instance, of the regionalism and the limits of the study, you could say. We're going to have to listen to the Huizhou scholars or the Fujian scholars to get the genealogy side of the story. See. Professor Lochner, I think you're muted.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, there are a lot of questions, and I don't know whether, do you see them or on your computer? Okay, there are three questions or
Yes, I
even
do.
more.
I do.
Yes, but okay, time is running out, but let's just continue for a couple of minutes.
Okay, okay, sure. Excellent. So let me just say the compass. So I see maybe a couple of questions here, um, or at least one question about the compass. Um,
Mm,
so here's what I'll say. Um, in my view, there really was not a linguistic distinction
mm,
in Chinese between navigational and geomantic compass. That essentially the Zhinanzhen or Luopan or Luojing can be used. You'll see it in a navigate. You'll see, for instance, Zhinanzhen south poising needle, and you'll also see geomancers invoke that term. So Joseph Needham has an exquisite discussion in his history of physics and the material science in China about the history of the compass, but there's still a lot we don't know. And in particular, we all know, for instance, the compass was invented in China out of divination. I'm sure this audience all knows that well. The question is, did the geomancers ever give up their influence over the compass and compass-related practices in China? There's an assumption sometimes, with commercialization in the Song and navigational maritime going that the navigation people kind of take on their own way. Um, but what I see in the Qing is that, for instance, I mentioned in the Gazetteer the conspectus of the Grand Canal, which was written in the late 18th century. When the Grand Canal was mapped, it was mapped with a geomantic compass using geomantic directions. So, in other words, the people who had good compasses tended to be geomancers. And so therefore, you might not want to be burying, a grandparent, but you might still call upon them and they'll bring the knowledge in as they're mapping a certain territory, right? So the distinction between this is not all that clear. And I tried to bring out that messiness in the book, with some examples that, hey, is this map a feng shui map, or is this a regular map made with a feng shui compass? How do we read it? Um, so this is something that I think that's why I mentioned we need more work on the compass and how it was used, who had them, how many compasses were there in China, how rare was the object, all of that stuff. Um, so I think there's something really to say there. Um, yeah, Shipei, thank you so much. Good to see you. Thank you for your question on feng shui and yin yang. And so, what I will say about, I'm going to go with, I'm such a statist in a sense, because of a historian trained in that, right? Going with the state's definition, yin yang xue, right? The yin yang schools encompass feng shui studies and astrological studies, right? It was all under the study of yin yang on the local level, at least, right? From the Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. So basically, I find that yin yang shui jia or yin yang jia can encompass geomancer. Uh, but not all geomancers would necessarily be in, in other words, yin yang is a broader category. If that's my understanding of it, might be my bias from state sources. I also want to say, I realized from the Taoist tradition that in North China, some lay Taoists were called yin yang specialists, and things like that. So there's regionalism here, no doubt. But as I was saying, in the state sources, that's what I see. And then Chinese Christians and their prescription. Great question about Chinese Christians. Obviously, the disputes and the tensions between churches and all of that with geomantic disputes, I touch on it in the book, not in great detail, but I did touch on it. I don't know about Chinese Christians, though. It's a great question, and I would take a look at it. What I can say is I do have some discussions of what Muslims say about feng shui. And Muslims, of course, will take the line that they don't do feng shui. They'll say that. And it makes sense because feng shui, at least that specific term, was very closely associated in Qing society with delayed burials. Professor Lochner, do you need to get in?
You have this fine passage about the Sufi shrine.
Yes, exactly. So here's what I'm getting to. Here's what I'm getting to. So what I'm getting to is people who claim to not be doing feng shui, in fact, do what we would consider feng shui. Okay. That might be, we looked at the calendar, we picked an auspicious time in an auspicious direction, and we built the mosque. Now, you could say there's Islamic practices in which, the mosque is oriented towards Mecca. Maybe that's the auspicious direction. But in the Chinese, that's what they'll say. And of course, that it reads a certain way for a certain literati audience who want to make sure that everybody's okay, right? So, in other words, this is a very interesting discussion, right? About, what they say, what they do, right? How those sometimes divide. Professor Gosser, it's so good to see you. I'm glad. I think we recorded it if you want to catch it up, but I hope we get the chance to catch up soon. And that's true with Shipei and many other people here. Elizabeth Cascade, wonderful to see you. So many old friends here from Germany and Europe. Excellent. I think I covered the questions.
Thank you so much. I mean, I like this idea of, at least a family resemblance, to quote Wittgenstein, between medicine of humans and medicine of the earth. I really like that. And it makes me think more. Thank you so much, Professor Brown, Professor Schäfer. Hope to see you soon again. And many thanks for all the people who joined our talk today. Next talk will take place on February 6th. Have a good time and thank